In today's world, we often take for granted that our financial markets and institutions are grounded in hard science and quantitative thinking. But that wasn't always the case. It took a few actual scientists to bring real data science into the world of economics. And when they did, they elevated all of finance with their groundbreaking work. One of these pioneering scientists is my guest today. Very few people on the planet understand the convergence of data and economics like he does. And he's deeply concerned about a new potential financial crisis in the world of retirement funding. That's up next on The Q Factor. Welcome back to The Q Factor. I'm Greg Fisher, and I'm honored to have on the show today one of my heroes and a true luminary in finance, Dr. Robert C. Merton. Bob has been a professor at both MIT and Harvard, and in 1997 he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. He spent the last several decades prioritizing people over numbers, designing smart retirement solutions for investors just like you. Bob is deeply concerned about the impending retirement of the baby boom generation and about how realistic it is that our retirement savings can support our longer-living global population. We'll get into the retirement issue towards the middle of the episode, but our conversation begins with Bob's legendary leap from the world of pure mathematics into the world of economics. And by the way, we'll spend a few moments talking about a man we both deeply admire, the investing icon Jack Bogle. Sadly, Jack died just shortly after we recorded this episode, which is why we don't directly address his passing. Jack Bogle did more good for the end investor than virtually anybody else I could think of. He will be greatly missed. Here's my conversation with Bob Merton. Dr. Merton, thanks so much for joining me on The Q Factor.
Okay, sure.
Really, the motivation for me to start doing this podcast series, what we're calling The Q Factor, is that it is all about data and how data is really changing every facet of our world. But clearly you were one of the pioneers in this space, going back to the 70s and 80s. You were really one of the first true scientists, I think, to apply these financial theories and eventually apply them in what I think to be a very practical way. This application and implementation we've been talking about.
Yes, well, that happened in the 70s for sure, and it's carried on ever since. That in practice in high science and finance, academic finance, I'm talking about very sophisticated models and data and so forth, really happened there. They got together, and that's why finance as a field is a little different than most of economics, in that the actual models developed and the research and so forth and get used. But I would just say on the issue of data, I think I have the view that data without a theory to interpret it is largely noise. I don't buy into the idea that if we just scrape trillions of bits of data, the data somehow by itself will tell us things. I think if you don't have a way of interpreting the data, you have nothing.
Thinking more about your background, so you then had this life-changing epiphany while getting your PhD at Caltech, which caused you to completely shift your focus and change your career from math to economics. Take us through that moment in your life.
As far as an interest in economics, particularly things like the stock market and risk and uncertainty, I traded convertible bonds, warrants, over-the-counter options all through grad school. So I was always interested in stock market and those things. Walter Heller, who was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, he came on and said, we've now solved the major problems of macroeconomics. No more, super hyperinflations and no, deep recessions or depressions. We know how to. No longer we're going to have those. That we sort of cut off the bad tails, and what's left is we have fine-tuning. Well, of course, later on, within 5 years, Mother Nature showed us that we maybe were a little bit arrogant or a little bit overconfident when she delivered to us stagflation of the 1970s. But at that time, I thought, wow, that's incredible. If you could do something, nothing that big, but if you just could do something in this field that it would impact, millions of people in a favorable way, well, maybe I can actually do something in this field with my combination of sort of intuition and interest or passion about things like markets and so forth. and my quantitative skills.
Now you're studying economics at MIT, and there you come across one of the most important influences in your life, but I think for anybody in finance, probably all of our lives, Professor Paul Samuelson. If you would, tell us a bit about Samuelson, how he shaped your thinking, influenced you, and some of the ways that he continues to influence you even today.
Well, when I started at MIT, I'd had no formal economics training. And so I kind of had, in the formal sense, I was just starting from scratch. I should mention that I applied to 9 graduate schools. 8 turned me down flat. 1, MIT, which was probably the best department in the world at the time, not only took me in, but gave me a full fellowship. So it was an easy decision. I had one place I could go, but it was a good place.
I bet you the rest of them really regret that decision. At least I would think so.
Well, there's a much longer story as to why it happened, that strange thing. But in any case, I learned my formal economics. I showed up at the sign up the first day and talked to the graduate officer and contritely said to him, all right, I'm going to take micro, macro, and history, economic history, and everything the book told me. And he said, yeah, you do that, you're going to be so bored you'll leave here. And at the end of the term, go take Paul Samuelson's advanced, mathematical economics course. And I tried to explain to him I hadn't had any economics, and he said, don't care, just go do it. So that's how I ended up in his class, and I took it, and I actually kind of learned my formal economics backwards because I started with the advanced class and then kind of went back and learned micro and macro after that. And it was good because the mathematics I was very comfortable with, and it was really exciting to be able to see how the math could be applied to all kinds of things at that time, growth theory and all kinds of things. And then just briefly, one day he just asked me if I would read over a manuscript that he had written involving Hamiltonian mathematics or something that he was doing for growth theory, and just for the math. And so I did. I worked all night, as you can do when you're in your 20s. And,
right.
Went through it over and over again and marked it up, and then as much as a 20-something-year-old could do, I came in the next day and sort of casually left it with him the next day and didn't mention that I was up all night. And
you just dropped it on his desk or something like that?
No, I just brought it into his office and he was there, and I said, here it is.
That's
I sort
great.
of believe, when you get some requests like that, you do it immediately.
Exactly.
In any case, so when I came to class the next time, he asked me if I wanted a job. So he hired me, and I became his research assistant, moved into his outer office, and such at the beginning of my start in economics formally, I sort of ended up living in his office, and that, of course, was an extraordinary opportunity for me.
I was with a friend and an investor this morning, and we were talking about how important it is to have, great leaders or mentors or just the people around you and how they may be influencing you or supporting you in ways that you don't really realize at the time. But hearing that story, for me personally, I'm someone who's been thinking about and studying finance since a kid. Just hearing you particularly, and then you with Samuelson, and it's amazing for me to be having this conversation with you. I'm thankful that we're doing this together. I'm a fan. Thinking about the story you just told and, just hanging around at MIT, you then eventually met Myron Scholes, with who you, of course, then eventually go on to share the Nobel Prize with. Before your collaboration, as I understand it, there was really no way to properly price derivatives. And if that's the easy way to describe it for our listeners.
Fisher Black and Myron Scholes were working together on this problem, and I was working on it. Well, I had done a paper with Samuelson in the area of warrants and options. I was working on it more or less on my own. And I met Myron and when I was interviewing for a job here at Sloan and MIT. And eventually I found out they were working on the same thing. We talked about it. And, of course, that was a common interest. And then it was a while later that, Myron and I, after I began working, we became, close friends and talked about lots of stuff, although we didn't really do formal research together. We ended up doing more sort of practitioner work together than than fundamental research, although we talked about research as we did with all our colleagues. Myron decided to tell me what they were, what was at the core of what they were thinking about on how to solve the option problem. And he described to me how they sort of had this idea of mixing, creating a portfolio which had a option and some position in the underlying stock and the risk-free asset cash, you could think of it as, and mixing them in such a way so as to create a particular risk characteristic to the overall portfolio for which we would know what the expected return should be in equilibrium. That's a bit jargonese, but what it's directly saying is that they would create a strategy in the stock, the warrant, and or the option and the cash, such that the so-called beta of that portfolio was zero. Now, beta is a jargon term that measures a kind of measure of risk that tells us something about expected returns. And according to a very well-known theory of asset pricing, if any portfolio stock or anything has a zero beta, it must have an expected return equal to the sure interest rate.
Right.
I went home that weekend and I applied it, but I did it in the context of the work I had done, which was continuous time dynamics, where I was able to, I assumed that you could trade very, very frequently and the limit continuously. And when I put it, what they had done in there, I discovered something that was really turned out to be pretty cool. And so I came back to the Byron on Monday and I said, I was wrong. You're right. This is the right formula.
I remember learning about this stuff in the late 80s, 90s in school, and when you figured it out, it was like you'd get up and do jumping jacks because it sort of added up. Learning about how this works.
It turned out to be a cornucopia of things because it was really a general production theory for any financial contracts, derivative contracts, and so you could use it to price corporate debt. You could use it to have a unified theory of the pricing of all the liabilities of the most complex capital structures. You could use it to figure out the value and risk of guarantees, deposit insurance.
It's hard to imagine a world before this. For me, it's so matter of fact, but it's hard to imagine what the world was like before this model and process existed.
It was done in the 1970s. Well, if you look at the 1970s into the 80s, that was the biggest wave of financial innovation we've seen in modern times. And I mean modern times in, decades, hundreds of years. If you look at the list of things that happened in the 70s, in part in response to all the crises of the 70s that were occurred. But, all of the financial futures, the options market was created, which is an insurance market.
It's like innovation out of necessity.
Yes. In fact, it was definitely driven by the explosion of risk. It doesn't take rocket scientists to figure out that 10% from the U.S. government, full faith and credit with a tax break, is better than 5% from a bank. And lo and behold, there was no money in the banks for housing, and then you had the money market funds were gotten there. We got rid of the cartel on commissions, New York Stock Exchange.
I like the choice of words, cartel. I came online in the 80s when, all of a sudden, my generation was sort of that first generation of people who could afford to have a home computer. So I got interested in thinking about data at that time. But, here we are 50 years later. We have 50 years of additional security price data.
It's one of the fun things about living long enough. I was actually there doing it.
That's cool.
But, think of indexing, right?
Yep.
Now, it's trillions of dollars. Everybody, you don't have to agree it's the best strategy, but everybody agrees it's a prudent strategy. And most people would say it's a pretty hard strategy to beat. And furthermore, and it makes all sense. Now, you may or may not know, but the original prudent person rule said you must look at each investment by itself and establish that you think it's proper and prudent for your client. There was not a portfolio concept in that sense. Each element of the portfolio had to be justified as prudent. And so could you imagine what their socks went rolling up over their head? These guys are out of their freaking mind.
I remember back in 1993, I was at a conference when they rolled out the Uniform Prudent Investors Act. I guess they realized in the early 90s that diversification and asset allocation, all the things we all just accept today, was a smarter approach. There was an article where Bogle was quoted, Jack Bogle from Vanguard, another icon in our industry, talking about the possible problems of indexing. He goes on and describes that, right now something of about 20% of the value of the American stock market is in index funds. When you add that to the assets that a lot of these managers that run the index funds run, it's something like 35% of the assets controlled by the same mutual fund companies. Is there some problem with this? Is there a point in the world where, the idea of indexing, as I understood it, was that, hey, if the price of securities in the market are there because there's lots of people searching around for mispriced securities and inefficient things and, doing all the work necessary to figure out what the price of a stock should be. And ultimately, why do we need to bother with that? Because, if everybody's doing this, billions of people around the world, a good estimate of what the stock price should be is what it is. Therefore, we just buy the market basket, and that's been a great model, one that I believe in. Now, here we are, that idea, 40 years later, with, 20% of the assets in mutual funds and index funds. Is there some point where that model breaks down? Bogle, in that article in the Journal, talked about it as it relates to public policy, that if a third of corporate America was owned by 3 companies, how would that influence, proxies and voting?
Well,
but I'm thinking about it more from an investment point of view. How could the price of a security be a good estimate of what it should be if nobody's looking for what the price should be?
Well, first of all, there's always, that's an old paradox that I say old, in academia, Grossman, Stiglitz wrote this paradox. Well, if nobody was an active investor or did any investigation, the prices could be anything. You can't be efficient. Because they incur costs to do the studies, and so if they can't make money on their costs to cover their costs, they won't do it. And while that's valid, I would point out that there's all kinds of information, getting away from a paradox, but the paradox is gotten rid of, that there's all kinds of entities that generate information that's marginal cost is free. So, for example, if I was prohibited from buying stock personally, I would still find out if I had a business about my competitors. Why? Because I want to know about them, how they're doing, what they're doing, because I'm in business and I need to know what my competitors are doing. I certainly have to know what my customers are doing, and I have to know what my suppliers are doing. And that's independently of me wanting to do any trading. But I'm generating from that study, from that necessity to me to know that, running a business or running an activity, that's enough information so that you get rid of the paradox that there's no information. Now, it's like the old joke. Once you establish the principle that there's information there, it's not zero, then it's a question of haggling the price. How much will you be willing to pay to improve the information in the marketplace? And that's a matter of technology, the return for gathering information. But you've gotten away from the paradox. I just tell you that so these nice-sounding, seemingly paradoxical results, really, like most paradoxes,
right,
once you examine it, it goes away. But what I would say on indexing, first of all, I would distinguish indexing from passive investing.
Yes.
Indexing is a specific, which I can always beat indexing. I sound like a very strong statement, but it is true because if the advantage of an index is you can monitor me. You don't need to trust me. If you're doing the S&P 500 or any other fixed index, which is a fixed rule,
yes,
you don't have to monitor me in the sense that all you have to do is look and see if I'm holding the proportions exactly as specified by the index. If not, you'll see it. It's transparent. Secondly, you could look at my returns and see whether my returns have tracking error, which is what's done. And so it's very easy to monitor. The problem is that once you have a fixed index, I'm forced to do things like pay money to J.P. Morgan or Morgan Stanley or Goldman to give me a 4 o'clock closing when there's an inclusion into an index and pay for it just so I get max minimal tracking error.
Right, you're forced to
Both buy
trade.
and sell. Well, that's costing money, and obviously, if you step back for a second, it's totally ridiculous. There's no economic reason that you have to get precisely the 4 o'clock closing.
Right.
But the reason is because you're trying to show transparently that you're tracking the index so that people will trust you. So, I mean, I'm not saying it's foolish. I'm pointing out that if you don't need that, you can improve on it. I mean, you can do things like stock loan, which are not included in the index returns. So just for stock loan alone, I can generate extra returns and beat an index. So beating an index is pretty easy.
Right.
Not because I'm a better forecaster, just because it's a good idea in theory until you realize that there are impact costs and you're forcing yourself to transact. And if the index doesn't include all securities precisely in their market value, and since most assets don't trade, like human capital, there's nothing special about evaluated index in terms of optimality even. The theory, what the CAPM is really saying is hold the best diversified portfolio you can, which in theory would be all the assets in the world in proportion to market value, but we're not close to that. And there's no theorem that says that if I have a portion of assets, stocks, bonds, other traded securities, that the right proportion to hold them to approximate the world is a market weighting, because that's just not true.
Right.
It's easy to show that's not true, because what you want to do is hold assets that will help you correlate with those assets you can't hold, like human capital, and therefore you don't want the market weight. So that's a fast pass to say that indexing as a subset of passive investing, is good. It has certain features, like I say, it's easy to monitor, and that can be important, but it's certainly not the optimum solution.
Thinking about all the data and this, plethora of data that's out there, and again, there's so much of it, it may probably not be useful to too many people if they don't know what to do with it. But this idea that there's information in the market, I think back to looking back and studying historical stock market prices. And of course, there's 50, 60 years more data to do that with, more powerful computers, more people thinking about it. We're all torturing this data so many ways. But is there something new about that data that we can be thinking about? Or is there some information in the market that can help us predict the future?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm driving at 30 meters a second, looking in the rearview mirror. You hope that what's in front of you is similar to, ideally the same as, where you came from. But that's it. You can actually extract from current prices forward-looking information, different from historical information. And the reason is, let's take an option, for example. People that buy an option today, I mean, the best example I always use the data for is when we had the first Gulf War. When Bush Sr. announced to Saddam, you've got a deadline. If you ain't out, we're going to war.
Right.
I don't care how quant you are in your hedge fund or anything else. You never leave the machines running and go home.
Exactly.
So the whole area, this is a big growth area, I think. It's the whole area, and we can do this, for example, with caps and floors on U.S. Treasuries. There's so many puts and calls there that you can actually, on all different strikes and all different dates, that you can actually map out a forward-looking distribution from those prices. And you don't even have to assume any particular distribution. It literally will give you an empirical distribution looking forward. Well, that's wonderful information, completely different from historical information.
Absolutely.
They put a number in there. Usually they use the risk to do it, like in the CAPM. They estimate the beta and then use the beta to estimate the expected return. The beta, of course, is a risk measure, not an expected return measure. And if you look at what we do in finance, it's always about what can happen, not what we expect to happen. And it's the risk that is
the range
the
of
focus
outcomes.
of everything we do. It's the range of outcomes and maybe the likelihood of some of them, but it's the range of outcomes. Finance is all about the distribution, not about the point.
Yes.
And that's what makes it different. And why I bring that up is What all the data will help us to do maybe is to better understand risk, better decompose it, etc. We'll be able to understand things better, but we'll still need the models to interpret the data.
That's right.
Market prices by themselves without a model interpreted can't answer the question. But with all this talking about, particularly from Silicon Valley tech types, that all we have to do is scrape billions and billions and billions of pixels or whatever off the thing and let our computers run and run and run, and they'll find the answers to all questions. And the answer is, no, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it's more complicated. The thinking about the concept of data and transitioning into, I think, something that I know that you're really passionate about now. We just spent a while together talking about the history, the models, CAPM, Black-Scholes, Merton, the $5 trillion in index funds, all the data, torturing the data. At the end of the day, it seems like something that you're really passionate and focused on now, and it's certainly near and dear to my heart, is how do people across the world interpret all this, and how do we help them take all this knowledge we have, all this learning we've done, and all the learning we're about to do, and apply it to something that's critically important to them, their ability to retire or maintain their standard of living when they stop working?
I'm going to get very simple very quickly as to what people can do. That's different, what they can do. But
Gotcha.
In terms of the problem, technically, and I'm smiling because that was the problem that I decided in 1967 and 68, that is the problem that I chose to try to solve on my own, was exactly the lifetime consumption portfolio problem, which of course includes retirement as part of that component. And that's something I did almost 50 years ago. The fact that the problem isn't simple to technically solve doesn't mean it has to be complicated for the user.
I'm really happy that someone like you is focused on this. I think that sometimes we'll meet investors and they say, hey, can I just go online and type in, I got 80,000 today, I have to save 50,000 a year, I'm going to earn 8% in the stock market, and I'm going to retire at 65 and be happy.
No one is earning 8% risk-free, and certainly risk-free protected for inflation. And so
that's right.
First of all, this idea that those numbers that people throw out have risk around them. And they really do have risk. I mean, people think that in the long run they don't really have risk. That's a nice, convenient story. So now all we have to say is, hey, if you stay around long enough, stocks will do it for you. First of all, that's mathematically, the arguments that have been used for that, using the law of large numbers, are an improper use of the mathematics. Japan was the second or third largest GDP country in the world for the last, since certainly the 1980s. All right? It is politically stable since World War II. It's rich today. It's wealthy today. It's, had no, it's had a couple of natural disasters. It's sad, but nothing weird has happened to Japan, except where was the Nikkei in January of 1990? It was 39,000. Where is it today? 24,000. So we've gone through 28 years in not a small little country with revolutions, not Venezuela. We're talking about a wealthy, stable, wealthy, and still wealthy country that in the world. And by investing in stock markets for the last 28 years, it's not only not made you money, it took you from 39,000 to 20 whatever, 4,000. Yes. And had you looked at it 5 years ago, after 20 odd years, it was 8,000. That's the underlying story that is used to argue by actuaries in our pension system that they can assume 8% returns not because they would agree that over a year it's 50-50 that the market's up or down, more or less. We've been playing this game where we've allowed, to sort of make us all feel good that we don't have to contribute because we can earn 8% or 10%. In fact, the biggest joke is that people work backwards and find out, advisors work backwards and they say, you need an 18.6% return to get to where you want to be. And your neighbor needs 13.5. But, it's now, you talk about the retirement crisis. Look at the history of the United States. The stocks have always come back. Well, if you can tell me who's going to be the leading economy in the world in 100 years, I know what to invest in too.
I remember during the financial crisis, I got a call from someone in the media, and they said, hey, everybody's lost half their money and the world's on fire. What advice do you have to give people during this time? I thought carefully about it. I said, save more. And he said, wow, that's a great idea. I think he was looking for me to talk about complex investment strategy, double down on emerging market. I don't know what he was looking for, but at the end of the day, are the solutions something as simple as save more?
Way out.
Right. Yeah, they were. And, to me, seems like saving more is probably one really good piece of advice. You talk about goals-based investing in some of the work you do. You also talked recently about the concepts of thinking about the value of your portfolio versus its future income potential. So you're sitting down with someone who's 30, 40 years old. We're thinking about this problem. It doesn't look like they're on pace to be able to ever afford to retire. How does all of this tie together?
First, you have to say, what the hell is a good retirement?
Right.
My definition of a good retirement, and by the way, for the most part, I'm thinking of working and middle-class people.
Yep.
Not because what I have to say doesn't apply to upper middle-class, affluent, mass affluent, and but the retirement crisis does not lie in upper middle-class to affluent people. One way or another, they're going to do fine.
Yes.
Because they get so much extra. The vast bulk around the world where this crisis is being called a crisis is about working and middle-class people. They're not poor. They just don't have a lot extra. So I would say a good retirement would be if I can give you, when you retire, allow you to sustain the standard of living for which you become accustomed in the latter part of your work life, not your average from the time you were a student, but the way you were actually living before you retired, that if I could sustain that for you for the rest of your life, that's a good retirement. Whether you're 25 or 55, you want me to have it that you agree, I've done my job. If I can get you so for the rest of your life, in retirement, you can sustain the standard of living that you had before you retired. How do we measure standard of living? We don't measure it by a pot of money. We say a stream of income that will support that standard of living.
I was thinking about where you started at General Motors and as it relates to this topic. I remember 25 years ago, all these investment firms coming up with this goals-based retirement reporting and these neat, cute, gimmicky statements. And the whole idea was, okay, here's your $1 million. We're going to focus on the goal. In 20 years, we want you to have the equivalent of $50,000 a year to live on, adjusted for inflation. Just stay focused on the goal. They got rid of all the performance and benchmarks and indexes, and they were hoping that the investor would not look at the volatility of their portfolio, but instead would focus on the goal.
I'm going to push back to you on that.
I love it.
And here's the pushback. We in the D.C. area are responsible, and I include the government, the regulators. We are responsible for them being that way, not them. What we do is we show them the NAV. We send you, every time we send you a statement or you go on the screen, we show you green for up in value, red for down in value. We teach everyone. They don't know this stuff. We teach them. That's what they should look at. We teach them good, green, bad, red.
It's a great point. It's blame the teacher, not the student, right?
We train them. We show them what they should look at. We say, oh, your stock price is volatile, very volatile. This has got lower volatility. And it's a mess.
I remember one of my best clients, and unfortunately passed away recently. I met him, in the early 90s, was with me a long time. And he said, when I met him in the early 90s, he said, Greg, best investment I ever made was my house. I said, why? So, well, it wasn't because it did better or worse than the stock market. It's just that I never got a statement telling me what it was worth, and I held it for 40 years, and I ultimately made a lot of money on it. Along the way, if I was getting a statement every month telling me what it was worth, I probably would have sold it. This idea of annuities or pensions, the idea of not experiencing this monthly, daily price volatility or it's interesting.
I don't think you shouldn't show them things monthly. You should show them the right numbers monthly.
Exactly.
You should show them their funded ratio, not the value of the account. You're saying, for a good retirement, you need what is now equivalent of $60,000. We're showing them the wrong number. And how can you, if we measure risk by the volatility of wealth rather than volatility of retirement income,
right?
That's the volatility that matters.
I've been a portfolio manager for about 30 years, working with these people we're describing, managing their assets for their retirement. And I think we've done the best job we can, but I would love to change the conversation in the way you're describing. It would be so healthy for the American people.
I mean, I solved this problem technically. I mean, mathematically, theoretically and everything, that long time ago. But it's amazing, since when I first started 15 years ago, people thought I was crazy. Now, more and more, and they're all talking about income. They're talking about it in the wrong way, and there are things to do. But we're getting there. So actually, I'm optimistic we'll get there. It's just we either get a hard landing or a soft landing. I prefer soft landings if it's possible.
Me too. How serious is this crisis? Like, what could really happen?
Well, I mean, it won't be a crisis it could be a crisis like we had 2008-9 in the sense that it's possible the PBGC is going to go under for sure. It's just a question of whether we're going to fund, the government's going to step in the way they did in the S&L and bail it out, but if the PBGC goes down and it's not bailed out, if a bunch of insurance companies, get a run on them, in the sense that it is possible to have a run. It's possible, but I think it's a different process. You don't see it in a year, except what's happening is you're building up an incredible underfunding, and something is going to have to give it some time. And when that happens, that'll be perceived as a crisis. Let's just say it's a big problem now around the world. And to that extent, I think that's enough to call it a crisis. But yes, I would think that we would want to start by just using the data. You say, what can we do with data? To see that there's indeed a disequilibrium between what we want and the path we're on.
Yes.
And we have to get, I don't pick on the public pension system alone, but accepting that the public pension system is vastly underfunded. And that the move from employer DB to employee DC means that we have to ensure that the contribution rate is realistic. People have not seen how much was being contributed on their behalf into DB plans. They don't see that number.
Yes. This is my point about saving more.
And if they were putting in 15 or 20% or whatever the number is, the idea that somehow magically with 6 or 8% you can get anything like the same benefits is absurd. So set your goal, and let's say the goal is in good retirement, and in terms of current income, just so you're comfortable. If you're living on if you're earning $80,000, maybe you need $66,000 a year because you're not going to be saving in retirement or whatever that number is. Okay?
Right.
Look at what it costs you to replace what you are earning for the rest of your life, and you get that from looking at the price of annuities. You don't have to buy an annuity. The price of your goal is the price of an annuity. You can go on the internet. There are wonderful websites. You don't have to know anything about interest rates. You don't have to know anything else any more than you don't have to understand what an internal combustion engine does to buy a Bentley.
Right, the market's doing the work for you.
Look at the price.
Right.
Living the way they are today, but imagining they're 65 and about to retire, and they were looking at what would it cost to buy their goal. It would be $1 million to buy $66,000. Now, we know that's a nominal income, which actually means it's a declining standard of living, right? So you put in, I want an inflation-protected thing. What do you get? A price of $1.5 million.
Right.
So the first lesson is you can be fooled by letting people tell you, oh, I'll give you $66,000 a year, and people forget that's nominal, and that's actually signing up for a declining standard of living, which is not what you signed up for. You said, today, you're 65. If you were to want to get your goal, what would it cost you? This is a learning process. This is learning about prices, just like kids learn when they go to things, or like we learn when we go car shopping. What are the prices out there?
Right.
And they learn that this is costing $1 million or $1.5 million, and that's what they would need today to do it. And they say to themselves, okay, it's pretty expensive.
That sounds a lot more practical than these Monte Carlo simulations I see the industry putting in front of investors all the time.
I'm sorry, even the word simulation worries people.
Me too. It makes my neck hurt. I mean, you got to hear the conversations that I see advisors have with investors around Monte Carlo simulations, and if you live to 87 versus 85 or 93, and you have to earn 6% or 3% or 4%, and it's so complicated. It's a problem.
Somewhere down the road, they're going to say to you, I can't save enough to get $1.5 million for sure. In other words, putting my money in at 1.26% real in tips. In 30 years, it'll be, goes up 30%, whatever. You know what I mean? In other words, I can't do it. So I either have to lower my goal and keep certainty, or, and I haven't gotten there yet, that's why I'm trying, at some point we're going to talk about risk. Don't start with that. I'm saying this is really simple. You say you're 65, your goal is $66,000 a year. What does it cost? And why you can say that without any ifs, ands, or buts is because it's certainty. It's not an approximation. It's not assuming you live 22 years. It says if you live to be 120, you still get paid. This is for life. This is your goal. They understand that. This is like I go in for my medical checkup, right? When I go see my MD, she's a PhD MD. She's fantastic. She's the best hospital, one of the top 10 hospitals in the United States. Okay. I want her to say to me, Mr. Merton, if I didn't know you age, I would think you're 10 years younger. That's what I want her to tell me. But if that's not true, I don't want her to tell me that. Otherwise, what's the point of the checkup, right?
Right.
I want her to tell me if I've got a problem. Otherwise, why bother?
That's right.
She's telling me I got a serious problem. Then what does she say to me? But there's something you can do about it. You can take statins. That's, to lower your cholesterol. You can change your diet, and you can exercise. So here's what I say. If under your current things we look at it and we come back and we say, Mr. Merton, given where you're saving now and your things you're doing now, your chances of getting your goal are 50% or less. That's like a D minus. It's terrible. That's the bad news, and it's direct. But then you say, what can you do to improve it? And I say there are only 3 + 1 ways to improve your chances. Coincidentally, the same as my medical example. First one, save more, which means consume less. Second one, work longer. That both gives you more time to earn, less time to have to pay for in retirement. And so we know that is a way to improve your chances of getting to your goal. Third, take more risk, but then you add, and have a plan B if risk is realized. You have to have them understand that it's not a wink. Take more risk, you'll get the higher expected return of stocks, but you're not really taking risk. That's bad.
Yes.
What you say to them is, look, we take risk for a reason, not because we like it, because it gives us a chance to get somewhere we can't get without it. So if you've saved all that you can, if you can't work any longer, then your only other choice is to take more risk. But understand you're doing that. And maybe if you don't want to take that risk and realize that you could end up in a really bad place, then maybe you should just revise your expectations downward. But now the fourth one, the +1, is get more benefits from the assets you have. The first 3 are really about getting more assets, right?
That's right. Save more, spend less, possibly take more risk, but have a plan
exactly.
if the risk doesn't work out.
Save more, spend less, work longer, so you accumulate more as well as need less, and take more risk.
Right.
The fourth one is get more benefits from the assets you have, more income benefits, retirement. How do you do that? There's only 2 things that really move the needle. One of them is annuities.
Right.
I mean, if I have a 3% interest rate and I just want to live on my interest, I get $30,000 in income per million. If I buy an annuity, I'll get 66,000.
Right.
Whatever the number is, 66,000. So by giving up my assets when I don't need them, I get income as long as I do need them. So annuity is one. The other is reverse mortgage, because if you look at working middle class around the world, the only personal saving that such people do is the house, the friend. They have maybe a bank account. Working middle class people don't have mutual funds. They don't have properties. They don't buy stocks and bonds. They don't do all that stuff. They have a house and they have maybe a bank account. Personal savings, in fact, you'll see the profiles, not just in the U.S. or U.K. or anything. I'm talking about even in developing countries, even Mexico. Now, of course, people have more modest houses, but they have more modest lifestyles. So I'm saying that you'll see that probably the typical retiree, the biggest asset they have is the house. It's bigger than their pension often. Okay? So that's the one asset they all have. You were saying, people aren't going to save 30%. Getting people to voluntarily change their saving is something that's going to take for a long, long time.
Yes.
And that's not practical. The driver of what they have to see is there's no free lunch. You either have to save more, consume less, work longer, take more risk, or you can try to maximize the benefits from assets by using this thing called annuity and reverse mortgage. And both of those are big. You notice those numbers are real.
Absolutely.
They're not estimates. They're not, if we earn you 12%, you'll have this much money. Well, how do I know you can earn me 12%? I have no freaking idea.
Right, exactly.
If you don't take care of yourself, you can't help anybody.
Absolutely.
That's really the message, right?
So true.
I think that's a great message for retirement.
Yes.
For working middle-class people. Say, if you don't get yourself a good retirement, you can't help your children. What's going to happen is you have a crummy retirement. Your daughter-in-law is going to be ticked as hell because she's going to have to come and look after you after she's put the kids and done everything, and she and her husband are going to have a hard time. That's not a free lunch for them. That's costly. What you need is trust. And trust is both trustworthy and confidence. If I have the trust asset, and I view it as an asset, this isn't about good people and bad people.
Right.
If I have trust, that's an asset, looked at from a business point of view. But my question for you, every time you do technology, you make the world more opaque.
Right.
So when you were doing spreadsheets yourself, at least it was transparent to you what you were doing. When you put your client data into a machine, it's no longer transparent to you.
Right.
So technology saves you money, cost and everything, but it always creates greater opacity.
So you think if Amazon came out with a solution to retirement, the one we were talking about earlier, they figured it out somehow and they automated the whole thing and delivered the low-cost solution for this, annuity / reverse mortgage / whatever.
Not necessarily.
I mean, if they did that,
necessarily.
Is it possible? Could they come out with something like that? Would that work?
Well, first of all, if they have the trust, if they can create the trust asset, yes. But that's not technology.
Right.
That's because they have the trust asset. And the answer is they may or may not. I mean, Samsung is a world great name, and they have a huge asset management business, particularly in Korea.
Interesting.
But they don't have all the business.
Right.
And just the fact that something's Google, it's like Nobel Prizes. I always tell people the Nobel Prize is for a very specific contribution.
Yes.
You're not Renaissance man or woman of finance or economics. How long would I have to manage your money before you could get a T statistic of 2 of whether I'm a good or bad manager?
40 years?
And 40 to 400, okay? But just 40 years is good enough. 40 years as a practical matter is not verifiable. It's not 3 years or 5 or 10. If you ask a dispassionate AI machine that question, it'll give you my answer. So this has nothing to do with, being able to do terabytes of whatever. That's just a fact, okay? Anything like that is totally opaque, and it's not verifiable.
If we could do that, that would be a great question to answer.
Some things, I really like the phrase. There's an answer to that question. We can compute it. It's just not the same answer to that question for every situation.
Right.
Einstein supposedly said he loves simple models, but no more simple than is needed to solve the problem correctly.
That's beautiful.
And that's the same thing here. That's it.
That's it.
And, of course, better tailoring can always be done, and that's what advisors can do. And we can do that better and better as we use technology, because I've been doing that. I've been running custom portfolios for large plans where you can do that. I mean, it's feasible. And then last, recognize that you must first take care of yourself for retirement before trying to take care of others. The mask dropping from the ceiling. You cannot help others if you are impaired. Bequests to grown adults are a luxury good, nice but not essential compared to your retirement needs. And finally, these are the parameters that are under your control. Too much emphasis on rates of return from stocks or other risky assets, or of course, risk-free interest rates change too. Those are things we don't control. We don't know what rates are going to be. And so your fundamental plan should be based around things that really are under your control.
That was my conversation with Dr. Robert Merton. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, go ahead and subscribe. And I'd be grateful if you would share it or post a positive review on iTunes. That makes the podcast easier to find and tells Apple and Amazon to give us a little nudge out into the world. I'm Greg Fisher. Thanks for listening.
Greg Fisher is Portfolio Manager and Head of Research at Gerstein Fisher, a division of People's United Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor and a wholly owned subsidiary of People's United Bank, N.A. Economic and market views and forecasts stated by Mr. Fisher are current as of the date of this podcast and are subject to change without notice. Mr. Fisher is not soliciting any action based on this material. It is for general informational purposes only. The views of the guests that appear on the Q Factor are their own and may not reflect the views of Mr. Fisher or Gerstein Fisher.